Coming to you from Burbank, California, I'm Colin Marshall. This is the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. Today I'm speaking with Scott Timberg. He is the co-editor of the Misread City, New Literary Los Angeles, as well as the new book, Culture Crash, The Killing of the Creative Class. Scott, you've written so much about music, so let me start off with this. It's an experience people have been having a lot lately, I think, and it relates to the thesis of your book. So in the, say, early 1960s, somebody would have looked at the top 10 singles, all the names of them, read each name of each song. Every song would have put a song into their head. They could recognize all the songs in the top 10. Early 90s, maybe they could recognize most of them, or some anyway. By 2015, the top 10 singles is now a niche. I think anybody's lucky, even kids are lucky to be able to identify 3 or 4 out of the 10. Most people I know probably couldn't identify any on the top 10. What does this have something to do, as I suspect, with your thesis?
Well, music may be the, pop music, let's call it pop music, rock and roll, etc. May have changed more than any of the other subjects the other fields. I write about architecture, I write about publishing and fiction and bookstores, I write about visual art, etc. Let me think. Pop music has, you think of the early 60s, the sort of era before the Beatles, compared to now, and there's been enormous, it's been less than 50 years, and things have turned upside down in all kinds of ways. Here's a salient difference, though, for my, book. You've had all these stylistic changes. You had psychedelia, you had punk, you had post-punk, you had disco, alt-country, etc. But, the biggest difference is that you had a network of labels, which after a while became independent labels, which are extremely important, for soul music, for indie rock, for alt country specifically. And you had obviously a network of clubs, especially say in the 80s, you had clubs that grew up that alternative rock, bands, the Replacements and Black Flag and the Pixies and bands like that, you had zines, you had rock critics, which rock criticism really started in the mid to late 60s. You had sort of an ecosystem that grew up around rock and roll that allowed it to deepen and like any ecosystem, it became interdependent. So part of what happened in the best of times. It's never been perfect. Making a living as a musician has always, or any kind of artist, has always been difficult. But part of what you had was a way that people who were interested in music and interested in finding out the best of it or finding something that suited their taste could be guided toward something that they would like or love. One sort of institution that did that was the record store and, the record store clerk. I learned a lot about music. I write about music professionally now, but I learned a lot about it from hanging out in record stores with people who are obsessed with this stuff, and often they were obsessed with an individual subcategory or something, but they loved the tradition that came out of Hank Williams, or they loved, Mahler and like really heavy, Germanic symphonies or whatever. But these people were passionate, informed, and sort of erudite in their way. I worked at a record store at Tower Records back east in the early 90s during the first Bush recession, and learned a lot from my coworkers as well as the employee discount, which allowed me to just buy a ton of Sonny Rollins records or Richard Thompson records or whatever. So that network worked. It eventually didn't work financially, but as far as a way to guide people and draw people into sort of being passionate music lovers, the record store, the people who worked there, was an important important institution. The other thing, again, was the music press or the rock press, which started with Crawdaddy and Rolling Stone and you could say the alternative press, Boston Phoenix, Village Voice, LA Weekly, etc., was in some ways an extension of the rock, of sort of the Rolling Stone, and rock press. You had zines, which were free publications that wrote about music. I wrote for a lot of those and made exactly zero money, but got to meet musicians and engage with things I loved. So there was, and again, not to mention labels. I mean, there were labels that people could swear by. I think Blue Note, for instance, in the 50s and 60s, the jazz label was a label that people trusted Blue Note. If there was a trumpeter or a saxophonist they hadn't heard of, they could pick up something on Blue Note. Stax Volt, the soul label, is that way. These days, I think None Such, the kind of eclectic, classical, jazz, etc. label has that role. Merge, which is a Chapel Hill-based indie rock label. Again, this world hasn't. Matador is a very good label. One of my favorites, based in New York, Rough Trade in England. I mean, this world has not died completely. It still exists in patches. But what I mean is that to follow music has gotten so much harder. There's so much more stuff going on. Good, bad, in between, a million different genres. You have electronica, you have, Nashville country, everything in between, Justin Bieber, et cetera. You still have indie rock bands, as well. Bell and Sebastian, Sleater Kinney, the Decemberists, et cetera. You have Flying Lotus here in Los Angeles. So it's big and it's rich and complex, which is good. But I constantly hear from people, and not just people like me in their 40s, but people who love music sort of at all ages, all types of tastes, that they're just lost as to what to get. So they ask me what should I find? What am I missing? And the age of the internet has offered a lot of good things, but we're sort of, it certainly has offered a sense of sensory overload. I think whatever your taste is, whatever your stake in this is, it's very easy to get overwhelmed with information. And again, that's why having a rock magazine like, Spin used to be something that people of my generation looked to, even if we, got frustrated at this or that review. It still provided a kind of common language for people to talk about it. You had, a Tower Records or an indie record store where they would get behind a local artist or someone interesting from England or whatever, and those clerks and the way the store was set up could sort of guide you to certain things. These days, it's kind of a free-for-all. Some people think it's better. To me, it's no substitute for the old structures.
It's one of sort of two halves of the point to be made in this book, Culture Crash, which is that it's harder to navigate the cultural world. There's so much out there, be it books, music, film, or the newer media out more recently. There's that, but then there's also the observation in the book that it's harder to be a cultural creator or any type of cultural worker than ever. So you have this combination of abundance and great difficulty. Which side of this came to you first as something to write about?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, you've summed it up right. I mean, it's a sort of, every period of history or cultural history is full of tensions and contradictions and overlapping, kind of simultaneous overlapping elements that can be hard to reconcile and figure out. But, the theme of my book is mostly about making a living in culture. I mean, and so the theme of my book, it's about the creative class, which is a group that I define as not just, a classical composer or, an abstract painter, or an architect, but it's the people along the way. It's the publicist at the record label. It's, someone at a newspaper who writes about visual art. It's the woman who works at the bookstore who recommends a poet she loves. It's people who sort of make the wheels of culture turn. So I'm mostly looking at the way those people's lives and careers are increasingly shattered by all these technological, economic, and sort of social changes. I mean, so the big idea of my book is that when artists and craftsmen can't make a living, we all pay the price. That it's not just about the consumer experience, that what happens inside that ecology I've described has obviously implications for those people when they lose their jobs, when the video store, like here in Los Angeles, Vidiot's goes out of business, when a newspaper critic loses his or her job, which is something that I and hundreds of people I know have gone through. Obviously, it has implications for people like us, very tangible implications. But it also has a larger cultural echo which is more intangible. It takes a little more time to sink in, but these are the things I'm writing about. And, the abundance is, the situation you describe is good for some people if you own, if you're a shareholder or on the board at a Silicon Valley, Yahoo, Google, Apple. It's great. These really are the best of all worlds. And no wonder we keep hearing from them and the sort of house organs of Silicon Valley, and the sort of techno-utopians in magazines like Wired and so on that it's a blast, it's awesome, it's great. Sure. If you own if you have a stake in one of these companies, you're a millionaire before your 20s are out. For people working in culture at, the kind of middle level, again, musicians, novelists whose advances have been cut in half, often architects whose firms have been destroyed or gobbled up by a corporate firm. Again, a bookstore, record store clerk whose shop has gone under because of Amazon or something. Things are not so good. So I wrote the book out of a sense of crisis. It was something that I'd observed kind of around the edges a little bit. I was concerned, but didn't really hit home until I got hammered by these changes as well. So it was really written out of a sense that there was a larger ecological catastrophe, and it crossed over all these different art forms, literature, music, visual art, and on and on.
You mentioned video stores, and Vidiot's, of course, here in Los Angeles, and it was fascinating because reading your book, I was reading the story of Rocket Video that you tell in there, which went under before I came to Los Angeles, so I didn't really have any firsthand experience of it. But while reading that, I was saying to myself, geez, I wonder how long Vidiot's is going to last. And the very next day came the announcement they were going to close. But it also reminded me they've been around 30 years, which is completely astonishing for a video store to have been around 30 years. I mean, but you, of course, you posted about this on your blog, and other people have been posting about it everywhere, lamenting the end of the Vidiot's era. But I wonder, what are they lamenting when they lament that?
Well, you make a good point that Vidiot's survived a lot longer than these others. I mean, it survived the rise of Blockbuster. It survived Netflix. It survived the economic crash. It survived streaming, content on Amazon and on and on. The thing about Vidiot's and, which is just a great video store in Santa Monica run by, really passionate, informed film lovers. There's a place that I used to go to when I worked in West LA called Cinephile, which I think has been sold, but is still there. Rocket was a place I used to frequent, and I interview one of the managers of Rocket in my Rocket Video in my book. It's some of these places, Vidiot's in specific, offered more than just places to rent a DVD. Rocket offered screenings. It offered they offered a series of benefits where David O. Russell or Angelica Houston or some actor or director would come to the shop and speak and sign books or whatever. Fans got to meet these people. So there were real gathering places, and Los Angeles has traditionally had trouble with public spaces and with sort of community, sort of community gathering spots, partly because of the size and because the city has been obsessed with private spaces anyway. So a place like Vidiot's or Rocket or Book Soup or Amoeba or whatever are places where like-minded people could gather to talk about culture. And in some cases, it would be something like an in-store, Paul McCartney or the Delgados or something like that, coming to Amoeba to play a short, free set, or again, it could be a screening of an oddball movie at Vidiot's. And I think people like, having these. I mean, not everybody, obviously, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes their ardor is not enough to save these places. But I think people like having cultural zealots in their neighborhood, and they like having these spaces in their city. They like having a place where people can gather and and talk about, buy and sell movies, books, records, and they also do something. Again, I call this an ecology because there are a lot of different. All these elements connect in unpredictable and sort of rich ways. The way the way Greenwich Village works, and Jane Jacobs' books. You see this sort of this kind of urban complexity when she would write about the way a village street would work. They also train and educate artists. Quentin Tarantino got his education. I don't think he went to college at all. He got his education at a video store in Manhattan Beach. Jonathan Lethem, the novelist, worked at Moe's Books in Berkeley and other bookstores, and got to deepen his knowledge of literature and criticism and all this stuff. Lethem didn't graduate college, but he came out of those years, with a deep connection to this stuff. Patti Smith worked at the Strand. Lucinda Williams worked at Rockaway Rockaway Records in Silver Lake. Alejandro Escovedo, one of my favorite Texas musicians, worked at Waterloo Records in Austin. A lot of punk rockers worked at bookstores and record stores. Peter Buck of REM, et cetera, et cetera. So these places serve a lot of different functions. When they disappear, it's all gone.
It's interesting you mentioned Jonathan Lethem because he was on this podcast a few months ago talking about just that, his experience working at bookstores. And he described why that's no longer a viable way up for someone like him. Partially, not really blaming the internet, but describing it more in terms of how inconvenient it was to find a book you wanted to find in those days. You had to rely on the Jonathan Lethems of the world. You had to mail out, and this is still something I have trouble believing, mail out letters to the book dealers you happen to know of. Say, if you ever get this book in, can you sell it to me? I'm sure you're not going to get a favorable price with that method. I mean, that degree of inconvenience, it's hard to imagine that now, to put your mind back to doing that, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember, this would have been maybe 25 years ago. I think I was home from college and I was back at my little town in, Maryland, and, I wanted to get a Lorca, like a book of Lorca poetry or something, and, a certain, obviously, English translation, and back then there was a small locally owned bookstore in my town that was delighted, really small town that was delighted to order this for me. But I think it took, like 2 weeks or something for them to get this in. Oh my God. So, that's the kind of thing. And I think I've had experiences with albums, CDs or vinyl, records, the convenience is great, but you're right. We live in a world where we expect everything all the time. You order something, everything now. The world has sped up, and our expectations have sped up, and those sort of intangible things, like what we expect from the world, are as powerful and as sort of decisive as economic and technological change. I mean, they all sort of work together. So yeah, the idea of filling out a piece of paper and dropping it in the mail and so on, it's like we're sort of living these days we're kind of living in three different eras at once. You can still see the old world kind of glimmering out, but we have this new world where everything arrives instantaneously. Right. And again, I love the convenience as much as anybody, but when it starts to put institutions I care about out of business, or it starts to kill jobs that passionate middle-class culture lovers have, jobs that keep culture people employed, then I start to see the dark side of all of this bounty.
Yeah, and I think everybody, to some degree, sees the dark side, because even someone who's really lamenting the loss of Rocket Video or of Vidiot's or of, say, Dutton's bookstore you mentioned that was in Brentwood. Yeah. I mean, people who, or of their local newspaper, music store, they have to face the fact that no one took it away from them. They sort of took it away from themselves, only in a small part. No one cultural consumer destroyed Rocket Video or what have you, but it's no one's responsibility but the people who stopped patronizing these places, these institutions, right? I mean, there's sure, Amazon has some business practices that maybe we would question, but we still buy from Amazon, Yeah,
I mean, I guess I agree halfway. I mean, and I this stuff obviously saddens me a lot, but I don't really blame the busy person who doesn't have time to go to the local indie record store. I wish that person would. I wish I could do it more often. I think I hope people will change their habits as this message gets out. The message that, it's not just my message. There are a lot of people, or at least a sort of, earnest handful of us who are, Jaron Lanier, Astra Taylor, Nicholas Carr. There's a handful of us who are trying to make some noise. So I do hope people change their habits, but I don't really blame the sort of busy consumer, especially, parents who are already juggling 10 plates and don't have time to support the local indie video. So I will say, I don't, where I guess I disagree with some people on this though, is I don't think it's inevitable, and I don't think it's, just sort of like the Lord works in mysterious ways kind of thing, or, this is the way the marketplace works, or we live in a new technological structure and we have to obey the edict of the mighty microchip. I mean, sure, technological and economic change is powerful and hard to resist, but there's still ways to have an ethical and sustainable kind of relationship to it. And, for instance, why were the bookstores crushed by Amazon? It's partly because Amazon was convenient and fast and all that stuff. But it's also because Amazon had a deal with the government that meant it didn't have to pay sales taxes. So when Amazon, and you didn't have to pay sales tax when you ordered it from Amazon, but if you got it at Skylight, Book Soup, Dutton's, Wordsworth Books in Cambridge, Mass, or any of these places, they had to pay sales tax. So who do you think is going to win that one? The federal government has a contract, I think it's $600 million or something like that, to Amazon for sort of cloud computing. I mean, human beings make choices. I mean, we haven't been totally automated yet. We may be headed there, but human beings and governments and regulatory, departments, Department of Justice sided with Amazon over publishers. Well, anyway, it's partly because of choices that we have made, and by we, I don't just mean voters and consumers. I mean the politicians we elect. I mean, slashing arts education from public schools, which goes back to the early 90s and has only picked up speed since then, is a choice that we made. Our values changed, and we elected politicians that said one thing and not politicians said the other. School boards, etc. Why do hedge fund guys pay less in taxes than you and I do? Why does Warren Buffett's secretary pay a smaller percentage, than he does? He's one of the richest men in the country. It's partly because of money and power. So I don't, and all those things, all these economic issues, the fact that the finance class has taken over cities and downtowns and former bohemian neighborhoods like Greenwich Village and much of San Francisco and Berkeley and name a city, and the bankers have taken over the place where there used to be record stores and middle-class consumer people. I was just in New York. I was in D.C. It's happening, all over the place. So it's not just like, well, it's inevitable. We have globalization. We have technology. You need to move out of the way and let the really strong, survival of the fittest, let the sort of virile people take over. No, it's because, cultural people and middle class people don't have that much money and power. Wealthy people, corporations, Wall Street banks, and the 1% do. And we're getting crushed. So my argument and my lament for the demise of a video store or a musician who can't make a living because royalty rates have collapsed or streaming royalty rates are so low. To me, it's all part of the kind of struggle of the 99 or 99.5 or whatever, the majority of us against the top tier of the 1%. This stuff is all tied together.
There's also the element of the difficulty of the 21st century, the difficulty the 21st century person has of articulating what they do want. Mm-hmm. They can say, even someone who's, pretty happy with the current landscape of the culture they can get, and they've maybe got objections to certain businesses or to certain remaining inconveniences, or they miss things from before. Mm-hmm. You can ask them, and I'm sure you've done this plenty. You can ask them, what do you want? What is your ideal world for the consumption and production of culture? And that's very hard to articulate, isn't it? No one really knows, from what I can tell, what that would be, right?
Well, this comes, it may come back in part to the sort of sensory overload issue we were talking about. I think that's, again, part of the intermediary between people, sort of what you could call regular people, consumers, or sort of people who liked or loved music or liked or loved books or something, and the creators. There was a connecting class, and again, to some extent, that was the press and the people who worked in these places. And those people tried, for the most part, to serve as sort of honest brokers. And I think, again, they helped guide things. As those people are removed and all we have is algorithms and AI, I think it becomes more complicated. But, two thoughts on that, which will seem kind of disparate, but again, it seems to me all related. First of all, if you ask people what they think an appropriate level of inequality is, people will say, well, there's always going to be rich people and poor people, and we hope there'll be a decent group in the middle because we have this vague sense that the middle class is sort of stabilizing and it leads to a healthier society. But when you ask people what the proper level of inequality is, and this is people across the political spectrum, this isn't just progressives or Democrats or whatever, they come up with something that is vastly, vastly more equitable than what we've really got, where we have this incredibly stark, sort of steep curve with a tiny number of people at the top, a kind of disappearing, eroding middle class, and a lot of poor people. We're sort of headed toward a banana republic arrangement. It's even magazines like The Economist, which is hardly a left-wing rag, are worried and concerned about the levels of inequality in this country, which are just growing and growing. So I think people don't quite now know how bad things are. Again, they might have a vague sense, the way I did back in around 15 years ago when I heard about Napster and how musicians' revenues were falling. I thought, oh, that's too bad. I wonder what I can do. But I didn't really engage with it, and most people didn't. My other thought is that I think there are a lot of people who want to support the sort of ecosystem, and they're not happy to have these places going into business. They're not happy that musicians and graphic designers and so on aren't are able to make a living anymore. There are some people who get it, and I'm meeting them as I travel around and talk to people behind the book, and it's been exciting to have the message get through. One thing, it's not the solution to everything, but one way I'd like people to think about this: if you care about musicians, novelists, artists in your community, etc., try to think about it the same way you think about the farmer's market or community-supported agriculture. I get a box sitting out front of the house. I get a box every couple of weeks of vegetables from a farm not far from here, and I can't really afford a very fancy one, but we get something regularly that helps a family farm, not a corporate farm like most of the Central Valley, survive. And we go to farmers markets and buy produce there. A lot of people in urban America and in small town America do, partly because they think the quality is better, but also because they believe in supporting people who do this. And there's this, again, vague sense that, small farmers, family farmers are kind of an important part of the American fabric. I think artists, musicians, literary people, et cetera, are part of that too. And if you can put your money into an independent bookstore here in LA, a Skylight, a Book Soup of Romans, et cetera. If there are artists, if you care about visual art and there are artists in your city or community, buy a piece of art from them or from a gallery. You may not be able to afford a big framed canvas, but you can probably buy a signed print, a lithograph, something that might cost $100, $200. If this stuff matters to you, you need to get behind it, and you also need to support politicians who share your values and care about culture and care about the middle class. People have individually almost no power unless they are, superstar bankers or something. But together, people can put their dollars, put their votes, put their support together and make some kind of those of us out here who value these things, who care about this, can make a positive difference if we all work, in our small way toward sort of restoring this ecology.
And indeed, you write in Culture Crash about how food is one of these areas where, as you say, with farmers markets, with these vegetable boxes, and much more besides. I mean, food critics are probably, how to put it? I mean, Jonathan Gold is so big here in Los Angeles. Wine and food critic,
Robert Parker, Jonathan Gold.
Yeah.
Good
People
writers,
listen to them.
Yeah.
It seems like you, I don't know if you exempt, but you highlight food as an area where people are showing more willingness to culturally engage. Why is food the one?
Mm-hmm. Great question. The growth of food, wine, craft beer, to some extent, sort of small batch, gins and rye and so on is it's interesting. And let me say, first of all, this, I'm happy about all this. I mean, when I was a teenager, and in college, beer and all this stuff was a lot less, it's a lot less pleasing than it is now. And the explosion of restaurants in LA and elsewhere. I was just in North Carolina, in Asheville and Durham, and every bar I went to had, they had 9 local ales and lagers being brewed, in the same building. It's great. I'm really happy with it. I guess what I lament though is that, food and wine and beer are sort of sensual pleasures, and there's nothing wrong with that. But literature and theater and music and these other things did something else. I mean, they did offer and do offer sensual pleasure and sort of beauty and all of these things. Getting at what that something else is tricky, but it seems to me crucial, and it seems to me the basis of a lot of what's gone wrong here. I mean, there used to be a sense that a poem or, a chamber piece or even a rock and roll song, a Beatles song, a Beach Boys song, a Smokey Robinson song, a John Coltrane song, was not just catchy and fun, but there was something that touched the soul about it or that provided a window into a sort of deeper reality. Like I as a high school kid, I read line by line in an English class. I read Dubliners, James Joyce's story collection, and it was just amazing to see how Joyce was with every little word choice of sentence length was telling you something about that city, about the character at the center of the story, but telling you something about what we used to call the human condition as well. And as a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, it just blew my mind what just a 15-page short story could do. And you look at Ibsen's plays, which are there's a sort of moral, ethical, social criticism dimension to them. I could go on. These days, and again, it's not like that old vision is completely gone, but we've had this sort of movement. It, I guess, started in the 60s and 70s. It came from Warhol. It came from the French post-structuralists like Derrida. It came sort of from Pauline Kael, who's a critic whose work I really love. But there was a sort of erosion of the sense that the arts, whatever art it was, really means something. Literature becomes about a system of signs. Art to a Warholian is just about the marketplace or about celebrity or about some really hip people hanging out, taking pictures of each other. There was not a coordinated assault by any means, but you got a transformation of the public sphere, of journalism and criticism, of academia at the high levels, and television, newspaper. In the end, you have a situation where the evangelists have stopped evangelizing. You needed to have people like Leonard Bernstein going on TV to talk about how a symphony works. You had, James Baldwin on talk shows. You had, in the 50s, Anne Sexton saw a PBS, I think it was, show about how to write a sonnet, and she was a suburban Boston housewife and saw that, and it launched her in this sort of brilliant, tormented career as a poet. You had what I call the middlebrow consensus, which sort of was the kind of domesticating of modernism, or the, you could call it a sort of, serious culture for a mass audience. The paperback revolution was part of this. That took place for a few decades, and then it started to get chipped away by people within the creative class. So let's get back to beer for a second. So if you remove all the stuff that makes culture holy, or that connects it to the soul, if we're just going to take what we used to call culture and turn it into content, then why not just have a beer instead? And why not have, these days, there are really good beers, and why not, instead of majoring in English and laboring as laboring in the world of culture, why not go to Wall Street? Or why not move to Silicon Valley and try to come up with an app that gets your pizza delivered faster? When people lose faith in culture and the kind of redeeming, clarifying, deepening work that culture can do, that literature can do, then, well, there's certainly no economic incentive. And again, the beer is getting better all the time.
No doubt.
Why struggle through an English degree or an apprenticeship at a record store when there's all this other stuff that's easier, quicker, and that will make you vastly, vastly more money?
Right. This talk about, the writing you do about the middlebrow culture, the middlebrow consensus in Culture Crash, it took me back to a book I read and a conversation I had with its author a few years ago. Probably you encountered a great idea at the time by Alex Beam about Mortimer Adler and the great books of
the. No, I've got to read that. And actually, a great idea at the time is a phrase that goes through my mind a lot. Thank you for reminding me of that. I've got to read that book.
It's worth for somebody who's reading your book, I would say it's probably the best companion you could have too, because they're both recent books and they cover the same.
Yes, and I like his writing from the Globe. Yeah, cool.
But I was thinking about that book, and part of what's interesting about that book is it covers it makes me anyway, sort of long a little bit for an era that I never experienced of the middlebrow consensus, where you had Leonard Bernstein on TV and people had, in general, had some awareness of these elements of culture that are now niche. But as well, I can totally understand why people might one day say, it's not enough for me to take Mortimer Adler's word that a book is good. What does that even mean? Who's this Mortimer Adler? Why are we listening to this guy who happens to be gray-haired and on TV? You need a reason to believe a gatekeeper, I guess. Yeah, and gatekeepers, I feel like it maybe more recently, or maybe it's been a long process since the war. I don't know. Yeah. Gatekeepers have not necessarily failed, but a reason to believe a gatekeep. We've lost reasons to believe the gatekeepers. Why? Maybe even if you looked up to the video store clerk who seemed to know everything as a kid, sometimes you wonder now, why exactly did I take that guy so seriously? You know what I mean? Do we have a good reason or not a good reason to have stopped believing in gatekeepers, I guess?
Well, I think there's been, this sort of social changes that I talk about in my book, or in some ways our changing assumptions are kind of the subjects that fascinate me the most. And, you had there's a great, an overlooked book by Peter Biskind, the film critic, called Seeing is Believing, about 50s B movies, science fiction, westerns, gangster films. And he looks at the sort of post-war cult of the expert, and this was the era, obviously, of Sputnik and the sort of, the worship of the scientist. And there was also a sense that government worked, that when the government person told you something, that you could probably trust it. All of these traditional kinds of authority, and again, this was an era where you would have professors on television sometimes talking about things. You had, as late as, I guess it was the 70s, you had the professor on Gilligan's Island, who is sort of a horn dog, but also is considered a genuinely smart guy who the women on the show kind of lusted after. So it worked through pop culture, too. I mean, it was just a larger set of cultural assumptions that in some ways came out of modernism and we doubled down on them during and after World War II. In Europe and Britain, these ideas are in some ways still alive in a way that they aren't here. You can still see Terry Eagleton and people like that on British TV, and they're much less upset funding the BBC and things like that. But anyway, so we had the middlebrow consensus paralleled the liberal consensus, right? So Eisenhower, who was a Republican, was not that radically far away from FDR. And there was a shared sense that an activist government, a regulated government, a government that built infrastructure, roads, interstates, for instance, GI Bill, which required high taxes, was okay. Similarly, there was a sense that culture was not embarrassing or some sort of seditious impulse, and the people who made it were somehow ennobled by doing it. So you even had Eisenhower, I think, sent jazz musicians around the world. Nixon, helped found, arts endowments. This was, John F. Kennedy had, musicians and artists and writers to the White House. The quote, I was at the Kennedy Center in DC, a few weeks ago, a quote from Kennedy about, the artists and thinkers and writers are the center of a civilization. I mean, so there was a kind of mid-century vision. You could probably say it goes back to FDR and the WPA. When we were coming out of the Great Depression, the artist, the theater actor, these things were, the documentary filmmaker, these things were all considered part of restoring a nation, right? Notice you didn't hear that this time around. So what happened? Well, part of what you're talking about is that we lost faith in culture, and we lost faith in the people who worked in it and believed in it. And again, I don't think it's that culture failed or that literature failed. I think there were other forces. I mean, we've had a sort of populist or faux populist, because it's not genuinely concerned with working people or poor people. It's a sort of faux populist rebellion against the arts, against expertise. I mean, the idea that sort of originates in Spiro Agnew and the sort of paranoid side of Nixon, the idea of the pointy-headed intellectual and so on, and the long-haired, reporter who you can't trust because he's going to sell you out to the communists. That's a lineage through conservative and right-wing politics that went through Dan Quayle. Newt Gingrich really amplified this. The whole talk of a cultural elite, which is people who aren't like you and me, you can't trust them, they're laughing at you. And most of these, I guess I'm in that group. Most of the people who are members of the cultural elite are not living in gated communities. They are not buying fancy condos in Lower Manhattan like the billionaire bankers, or they don't have big ranches in Texas like, George W. Bush or whatever. These are people who in some cases are, living out of their cars. I mean, these are people, book reviewers who are crammed into a tiny apartment, that's mostly dominated by books, and they're kind of, making rent just barely, every month. I mean, I'm a couple steps above that. But I don't have any more, that much more stability, than someone in that situation. So it was partly because of a sort of right-wing political push against people in the arts and culture. And in some ways, I think the political left, or you'd call it the cultural left, shot itself in the foot with all of this denigration of Western civ and the idea that literature was just the canon was just sort of a construction of white male power or something. I mean, sure, the canon needed to be revised to let more people of color and more women in. There's no, the canon of visual arts, the canon of literature, without question. But when you start sort of undercutting the very existence of great work, and work that's transcendent, that sort of offers a window into the big questions of the human experience, then you've got real problems. Then, as I said, why not just major in computer science and go to go to Facebook and try to come up with a new app, or why not just go to Wall Street and start making trading derivatives and chopping up mortgages and making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year instead of kind of laboring in some tiny, dark, dank apartment in Brooklyn trying to write poetry. And when you start telling people this stuff doesn't matter, or that it's embarrassing, or that it's just an exercise in cultural capital, then why should anybody do it? And more important, why should anybody on the outside, say a politician considering funding, or somebody considering, a wealthy person considering giving money to a museum or a library or something, these people have lots of places to park their money. You start telling them the culture doesn't matter, the message will get through to them loud and clear, and I'm afraid that it already has.
Before we sat down to record, I was mentioning being at the Paley Center in Beverly Hills the other day, looking at famous typewriters throughout history. Right. Orson Welles' typewriter, and Greta Garbo's cursive typewriter, which is pretty neat, and Truman Capote's typewriter, and the one that I noticed most was John Updike's typewriter, of course, because of the sheer volume that he wrote. That thing had to see a lot of use, but they also had some Time magazine covers from various eras with John Updike on them, and sort of I was thinking about his role as a writer of that generation. And it's something that I hear from writers more around my age and maybe younger, maybe a little older. I'm 30. They'll complain, and this is a sentiment you write a bit about in Culture Crash, that they will complain that in this day and age, in the 21st century, they can't just sort of sit and write all day, or sit and write their whole career as they imagine a John Updike did, or a Philip Roth did. And in a way I understand, sure, I guess if you really want to just spend all your time writing, you wonder why you can't do that so much these days. But also, the bigger question to me is, why does somebody who was born in the 1980s want to have the same career as somebody born in the 1920s? There's this sense that there's this resentment that the same careers that one's grandfather had are no longer possible, but I wonder why we expected to live the same lives our grandfathers did. You know what I mean? It seems like, why aren't you looking forward to what's possible next? You know what I mean? Rather than lamenting that you can't do exactly the same thing as John Updike did. I mean, I make most of my money writing, and that doesn't sound appealing to me. I don't want to spend my time writing. I want to do something different than other generations did, right? I mean, but there's, what's the story with the other side of that,
Yeah. Well, I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, I'm 45, so I'm kind of, we Gen Xers are kind of in this funny in-between space between the sort of mid-century boom, the liberal consensus, the middle-brow consensus on one hand, and the sort of we were educated during the heyday of postmodernism, and we're now in this sort of post-internet 21st century, whatever it is. And so I and people my age have sort of seen both worlds. We were shaped in the simplest sense, we were shaped by print in some ways, and we're now living in a post-print era. So we're kind of a hinge generation, and I call us amphibians. We can sort of swim in the water, and we can walk on the land, and we're kind of comfortable in both and not quite at home in either. I mean, my perspective is in some ways that of someone in his 40s. So I'll tell you how it looks for me. I mean, I didn't expect everything to be exactly the same. I didn't want it to be. My parents are into the Beatles and the Stones and Dylan and Ray Charles, and I was into the Clash and Elvis Costello and Lucinda Williams. I mean, I was shaped by different winds, and I was very into punk when I was in high school, which was a real sort of rejection of, I was into postmodernism. I fell hard for Thomas Pynchon and the novelists like David Foster Wallace, who came out of Pynchon. I love, Zadie Smith's novels. Would we have had, a black woman, of Jamaican descent, I think, as a major author in the 50s? Probably not. There's some things that are better, and there's some things that have just evolved. And I like Updike a lot, and Cheever and that sort of lineage. But I'm also glad that we have, Louise Glick and, Juno Diaz and David Mitchell and Rachel Kushner and Amy Bender. And, it's not, I'm not into saying everything in the culture has declined since the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Right. What I do miss, and if you study cultural history and social history, you see that the way artists have made their living has obviously changed since, Sumer and ancient Greece and Rome in the Middle Ages and so on. It's fascinating. I did a lot of research on this in my book, and I would really love to write another book. I don't think anyone would buy it, but another book about the history of this, from the caves to the 18th century or something. It's amazing. But so it's never been easy to make a living in the arts, and it's never been exactly the way it was a generation before. What bothers me, though, is that there was a way for decades, maybe for a couple centuries, to, if you worked hard, if you were talented, if you got some lucky breaks, etc., to have a reasonably stable middle-class career in culture. And again, it didn't mean that everybody who wanted to be a novelist could become one. I mean, my first passion as a sort of creative being was writing short stories as a kid, and that's what I wanted to do. But I realized I was, I just wasn't good enough to do it for a living. I decided to become a journalist who would write about novelists and jazz musicians and filmmakers and so on. And I paid all the dues that you do to enter a profession. I went to graduate school, journalism school. I did a bunch of unpaid internships. I slept on my mom's couch, after college. I worked in a record store with a very expensive, BA, English major while deferring my student loans for years and years. Went to a small paper, then a bigger paper, wrote for free for years to sort of sharpen my skills as a writer, a thinker, all that. And that's not unique to me. I mean, if I was becoming a saxophonist or a cellist or a poet or whatever, it would be the same path. So it's not, and I didn't expect I would have exactly the same career, journalistic career as, say, Russell Baker, just as my friend who's a landscape painter who lived in Venice and got flushed out by the economic collapse. I talk about him a little in the beginning of my book. He didn't expect he would have a career exactly like, Jackson Pollock's or Milton Avery's or whatever. What we wanted, though, was to make a living in culture in some way. We knew it was going to be hard. We knew we wouldn't be wealthy or probably wouldn't be famous, but we could make a living in culture. And, what I hear from young people, my wife is a school librarian and works mostly with teenagers, and I've done some teaching, writing teaching at Loyola Marymount, so I was dealing with, 21-year-olds who'd be a decade younger than you, basically. And they don't expect things will be exactly like they were for John Updike, but they'd like to have some time to develop their voice or learn their instrument or come up with some sort of connection to whatever tradition they want to work in. There's something that jazz musicians call woodshedding, sort of going away and being kind of in sort of in exile for a while and learning the history of what you're doing, getting good at your instrument, and then hopefully getting great at your instrument and coming up with some personal take on it. Every artist or craftsman needs to do at least a little of that, and then you want to, if you've gotten past certain hurdles and achieved and committed and all those things, built an audience and so on, you want to have some time to actually do what you're there to do. You want to be able to write poems at least some of the time. You want to be able to play guitar, whatever, write songs, write novels, design buildings. And if you're spending all your time worried about paying the rent, I mean, of course, financial considerations have always been important for artists of any kind. But if you are so pressed against the wall that you're constantly anxious and can't concentrate on your field, and if you're in this sort of post-label, post-publishing house, etc., free-for-all, free agent world where you're constantly tweeting, constantly on Facebook, you're constantly kickstarting, running around with your hat out, begging for $5 here, $20 here, having to repay people with free concerts at their house, signed copies of the CD. I mean, some of that is good, and there's been some good work that's come out of the crowdfunding model. And I'm happy that Stuart Murdoch of Bell and Sebastian got to make a movie, and he did it from crowdfunding, and other serious artists have done it. But the people I know who are doing that stuff, some cases are trying and not getting any, they're almost there and they don't get their funding and then it's over, or they're devoting all of their time to passing the hat and a lot less of their time to actually making their film, writing their songs, painting a canvas. So when it becomes change is fine. We expect change, and someone my age who graduated college around 1990 has lived through incredible social and cultural and economic changes, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the coming of the computer, the Reagan Revolution, the death of print. All this stuff happened just in my lifetime, but we expected it. In some cases, we enjoyed it. We did not expect it to eradicate our way of life. Right. That's when it becomes sort of a little more troubling.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Talking about the artists who have to struggle to do the kickstarting and the tweeting and the Facebooking and whatnot. And of course, you write about them as well in the book. I understand it when described that way, but my own career involves no small amount of tweeting, posting to Facebook, kickstarting. But one difference is maybe it's just the time I started, it doesn't feel like I've had to force what I was already doing into that model. It feels like tweeting, kickstarting is actually an organic part. It's as much what I'm doing as I don't even see the product I make, whether it's a podcast or something I'm writing or the way that I'm promoting it. Although I don't even think of it as promotion. The whole social media ecosystem, kickstarting ecosystem, and the stuff I'm making, it's all it's very hard for me to separate them and to say they're different things. Sure. But I don't know. Do you see that as a generational shift in mindset? I mean, whether you say this is a pain in the ass I gotta do to keep doing what I was doing, or it's just this is the world I designed my career to be in. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think it is a generational issue to some extent. It's also a temperamental issue. I mean, I have a book out called Culture Crash, and I tweet at the Misread City, which is the name of my anthology about LA. And I kind of like it. And I've been going to bookstores where nobody pays me to be there. I flew to the East Coast to do events. I go into radio to do interviews, which I enjoy. Nobody pays me for this. When I flew to the East Coast, like most writers these days, I paid every dime of it myself, every hotel, every meal, every flight, Greyhound bus, etc. I kind of like spreading the word for the things I do because I care about this message. I care about the people I'm writing about, and I want to spread the word. Similarly, a musician who has a new album or is doing a tribute to Nina Simone or something wants to get out there and play and spread the word and so on. So it's not like, social media or doing a busking tour or something is necessarily demeaning or awful. But I know plenty of people the person who said this most eloquently in my book is a former Angelino, Stu, the main guy in the band The Negro Problem, he's now sort of he's a playwright, and he does a lot of different things, as well as being a musician, but he lives in a building in Brooklyn with all kinds of, artists and experimental jazz people and pop people and sort of all over the map. And he says every conversation he has with them, no matter what generation, no matter how close to the mainstream they are, whether they're black and white, woman or man, young or old, is about how kickstarting and crowdfunding and Facebooking is taking up all of their time, and they're struggling to I'm heartened to hear that you don't feel like it's corroding or cutting into your, so anyway, I'm comfortable doing this stuff. I mean, I'm happy to, send out a tweet about something that angers or delights me, but partly because I'm supporting my book right now. This is a 2-week window where I'm kind of basically busking, and that's cool. I can do it. I enjoy it. But at some point I've got to get back to what I do. The other point, which I think is at least as important, is that, I'm sort of an extrovert. I mean, I like going into a room and reading and writing and thinking for hours and hours and hours, but I'm an outgoing person for the most part. And if being an artist or a musician or whatever requires you to be constantly on stage, constantly busking, constantly promoting yourself, you're going to lose, and it's already happening. You're going to lose people who are introverts and who have sort of a more monastic temperament. I mean, think about, like I can't imagine the history of music without John Coltrane. But Coltrane was a quiet guy who practiced his saxophone for 9 hours a day, wrote a lot of important music, played with other musicians to develop sort of empathy that grew. I mean, he was devoted to his art in a very deep way. I mean, we think of Jimi Hendrix as this sort of wild man, but Hendrix could only revolutionize the guitar by devoting himself to it and to the history of it, spending a lot of time playing. Think of Elizabeth Bishop, the poet. I can't imagine Elizabeth Bishop Facebooking all the time, and tweeting every little thought she had. The old model where an artist would go underground for a while and then come up some of the time to publish their poem, their poetry collection, to do readings, to go on a tour of rock clubs or jazz clubs or whatever. That system of sometime deep in doing the soul work and sometimes out in the public sphere on stage, that provided a sort of balance that allowed extroverts and introverts to be part of the mix. If you have to be on all the time and, sharing on Facebook and Twitter, some people can do that, but you're going to lose, would we have had Miles Davis? I mean, come on. I can't imagine the history of music without Miles Davis. I don't know that we would have had that career if he had to constantly be sort of, blowing his horn for his own work all of the time.
And what do you think about cities in general as a factor in all this? I mean, as whether a place to observe this or whether a place to be creating culture, a place to be distributing, gatekeeping culture. What do cities have to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, cities are at the absolute center of the questions I'm asking for Culture Crash. I mean, I did an event at the LA Public Library, a Loud series, and part of the group of us on stage was the architect Barbara Bester, who I interview for the book. I do a chapter on architecture, and she's written a book called Bohemian Modern, and she's a sort of Silver Lake-based architect who designs sort of how, cool modernist houses, but also, record labels. She did the Intelligentsia Coffee in Sunset Junction. And she compares herself to a locavore, in her resonance with LA's East Side. And having her on that panel made me realize, but I hadn't really noticed it before, but it made me realize that a lot of my book is about urban spaces and the importance of urban spaces and the importance of cities and the sort of dynamic way they work. I mean, whether it's a writer or a visual artist or a musician or an actor or a dancer or something, these people tend to come together and meet in urban spaces. And they tend, if they're preparing, if they're a band that's getting ready to play, if they're a theater troupe or a dance company, they're meeting in a physical space, usually in a city. I mean, you can have art and culture anywhere, in a small town, in the countryside, but having central places where people come together, talk about their work, and collaborate is crucial. So in my book, I do again, these questions and tensions run through the whole book, but and the high cost of rent in cities that have been traditional cultural centers, New York, Boston, Cambridge, Bay Area, LA, etc. The cost of living in these places and the way rents have become unhinged is a big challenge to creative people. But more specifically, I did an opening chapter. I think it's called When Culture Works or something like that. And I look at the way different artistic scenes developed in 3 different cities. I used kind of as the model the CBGB scene in 70s New York that David Byrne of Talking Heads describes in a book he wrote about music. And he talks about how punk and new wave kind of came together: Blondie, Television, Talking Heads, Ramones, etc. And I wanted to use his kind of lens to look at 3 places, 3 post-war cities, and see what went right, to make a cultural scene come together and that employed, for which artists could make a living and which an audience was engaged, and see what were the elements that were necessary. So I looked at 3 different times and places. I looked at 50s Boston, Cambridge, the confessional poetry scene that was centered around Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath. I looked at 60s Los Angeles and the visual art scene that included Ed Ruscha and Ed Keenholz and was based around Ferris Gallery. And then I looked at 70s Austin and the alt country scene that was sort of sparked by Willie Nelson and that led to the alt country movement and people like Lucinda Williams and Alejandro Escovedo and so on. And that chapter was fascinating. It was a lot of fun. I talked to a lot of people. I read a lot of books and tried to get at what makes this happen. And then how does it sort of cease to happen? And that was in some ways my favorite part of the book because favorite part to write because you see things going right and you see artists meeting and engaging and connecting and innovating, collaborating and all of that stuff. And I came up with some conclusions that are in that book. And, I guess my hope is that somehow moving forward in this new 21st century, post-internet world, we find a way to make it happen again and to keep happening. But we've got to take an honest look about what's going on right now. The invisible hand is not going to save us. We can't just sit back and say that the internet will democratize cultural life and it'll just happen automatically because history always moves toward happy outcomes. It doesn't. People have to take an honest look at what's going on around them and they need to commit if they value things. So my hope is that people will look these problems sort of square in the face and try to move us forward in a way that restores a creative middle class and restores the lives of artists and craftsmen.
You mentioned the painter friend who got sort of pushed out of Venice, and we talk about the video stores and bookstores that have closed in Los Angeles and various other elements of this city where it seems like you can see a lot of this cultural shift you write about going on. Los Angeles seems like a clear window to watch this happening. I mean, what about Los Angeles makes it a good city, if you think it is, to observe this 21st century cultural change in?
Mm-hmm. Well, California has always been, in sort of myth and reality, kind of a bellwether state, a sort of, we used to use the phrase in the 90s, cutting edge, or leading edge, something that in some ways is ahead of the rest of the Western world in transformations that will eventually shape the rest of the United States, England, Europe, etc. That's doubly true with all the things we're talking about. California has a large and complex and diversified creative class. It also has, with Silicon Valley and to some extent what they call Silicon Beach in Santa Monica, Venice, it has a high-tech world as well here in Greater LA. So part of what some people find interesting about my book is that it's a book about culture and about a life in culture that's mostly based in California and Los Angeles. So I write about Austin, I write about Boston, Cambridge, I write about New York, I write about and Britain to some extent. I write about a bunch of places, but it's very much shaped by me having lived in California for 2 decades and seeing changes. So what you get obviously we all know this in 2015 that Los Angeles has amazing arts institutions, whether it's the art schools or the LA Phil or the LACMA or the MoCA or whatever. And there's some wonderful bookstores, record stores, et cetera. So there's a lot of stuff here. It provides a kind of microcosm. You can observe any art form you're interested in some way here. So here's the other reason why LA is especially acute, you might say, is it has among the highest cost of living in the U.S. San Francisco's is a little worse, New York is a little worse, but LA is even more, there's something more difficult about LA even in those places, which is that the economic infrastructure that supports creative people and non-creative people is weaker and more feeble than those cities. In other words, the New York Times has had problems, obviously. New York Times is still a robust and well-staffed paper with a Sunday magazine, with a book review. They do all kinds of events They do incredible foreign stuff. I don't mean the New York Times is perfect, but you compare the New York Times, which is owned by a family, whatever its faults, a family dedicated to journalism and culture. I mean, the New York Times helped sort of shape arts coverage and journalistic arts coverage in the States by inventing the arts and leisure section and so on, covering theater and these other things, the art museum world, the classical music world. Compare that to the LA Times, where I used to work, which is still a very good paper. I get it every day, or at least a good paper. The LA Times was owned by the Chandlers, who were sort of tight-fisted, borderline libertarian rich people who after the Otis Chandler era, who was a great editor and apparently a great guy, had zero commitment to journalism, zero commitment to the arts, zero commitment really to Los Angeles. Many of them have left the city. These were just the worst kind of tight-fisted, selfish rich people. They sold it, and I'm going to stop, but they sold it to a bunch of fools who ran Tribune, which was an unimaginative company of sort of numbskulled, bean counters. And then, as if it couldn't get any worse, they sold it to Sam Zell, who not only hates newspapers, but hates journalists, doesn't seem interested in Los Angeles, and is just a sort of nasty little weasel. So the institutions, that the LA Times is a specifically unpleasant example, but basically if you don't have, institutions and families and so on that stand up for these things, they'll go away. So what you have is, again, it's not just about journalism. You have people who are happy and have careers in the arts here in Los Angeles. We have, at least two great conductors between Dudamel and Esa-Pekka Salonen, and I feel very grateful that they are here. And you have Annie Philbin running the Hammer. I mean, there's great cultural institutions and great cultural talent in Los Angeles. I don't want to sound like I'm dissing this city I've been in for 20 years. Or almost 20 years. But the problem is the economic infrastructure in LA is just not as strong as New York and the Bay Area. The cost of living is almost as bad. To make a living in culture and afford to live here when the average 2-bedroom apartment is something like $2,400 a month, it's basically doubled since I've been here. It's just going in the wrong direction. And, my wife and I and our son were flushed out of our little cottage in Glendale by the recession and by a bank that would negotiate with us and by the LA Times laying me off. And we were told by everybody, you get a lot of sort of optimistic BS when you go through tough times. People are trying to help, and I understand it, but they say, oh, well, a lot of people are going through this, and the economy is flat, so rents will be down, you'll be able to get something. Due to the economic structure, and again, laws, economic and political structures that benefit the wealthy and benefit, landlords. When we got kicked out of our house, we found a decent little place, a little cottage in Burbank, but we were paying probably 50% more than we expected to. There was just no other option to try to have a middle-class life and be near our kids' school. And this is, again, it's not just about me. This is true of everybody I know who lost their house in the crash. They've ended up renting, and they're paying more, and they're getting less. And again, this isn't going away. It's not suddenly becoming. It's not like the system will just take care of itself, or the magic of the marketplace will solve these problems, which is what you hear from people. So Los Angeles has a really rich cultural life, but it also, in sort of economic terms, it demonstrates the contradictions and tensions here. Mm-hmm. And it may do that better than any other city. And because of that, I think it was the right subject or the right kind of vantage point for the book, though I ranged to Britain, Texas, and a number of other places. But Los Angeles and California more broadly are crucial to the book Culture Crash, absolutely.
And it's here near Los Angeles, definitely California, Burbank. I've been sitting today on the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast, talking with Scott Timberg. He is the co-editor of The Misread City, New Literary Los Angeles, and the author of the new book, Culture Crash, The Killing of the Creative Class. Scott, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Colin. Appreciate it.
Again, it's been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with me at colinmarshall.org or with the LARB at losangelesreviewofbooks.com. Thanks.